Hi there. China and the United States are on the brink of a trade war. In response to U.S. tariffs, China has hit back with its own, and so far neither side is backing down. But underneath the rhetoric are two different views of how trade should be conducted and regulated. As a result, China has lodged a complaint with the World Trade Organization. So what are these underlying issues? What do national and international law say about what should be done? And will differences in worldview continue to cause problems for world trade? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Tao Jingzhou, Managing Partner of the Kurd LLP, He Jing, Senior Consultant at Angia Law Firm, and Edward Lehman, Managing Director of Lehman, Li and Xu. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Ri, but before we get started, let's look at this.
Trade tensions between China and the U.S. are getting worse. The Ministry of Commerce said China would lose no time in carrying out a series of comprehensive retaliatory measures.
China's position is clear and consistent. We firmly oppose protectionism and imposing tariffs globally. This is undermining the world economic order and interests of the U.S. partners. The U.S. always finds excuses and points fingers to others. We have noticed that the U.S. society and businesses expressed big concern about trade measures, and there is also big opposition from the international community to Trump's decision on tariffs. We will join them against tariffs and hope the U.S. can go back onto a normal track.
The statement came after Mr. Trump threatened to levy a new 10% tariff on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods. The Foreign Ministry again emphasized China doesn't want a trade war, but isn't afraid of one either.
I have to point out that the U.S. remarks confused the right with the wrong, and they made irresponsible accusations against China with the aim to cover up its own unilateral and protectionist moves. Recently, in disregard of our consensus, the U.S. demonstrated another flip-flop to ignite the trade war. It has lost its credibility to the people around the world and harmed the interests of the two peoples, the interests of the two countries, the enterprises of the two countries, as well as the interests of the people around the world. We don't want a trade war, yet we are not afraid of a trade war. We will continue to take effective methods to safeguard our interests, and we will also firmly uphold the economic globalization as well as the multilateral trading system.
China is not alone in taking on the U.S. over tariffs. Russia says it will impose duties on American goods in response to U.S. tariffs on metal. The U.S. in March introduced a 25% tariff on steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum imports from Russia. Moscow expects to lose a combined $3 billion over the metal tariffs. At the beginning of June, the U.S. levied steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and the European Union. Canada and EU countries are also set to retaliate with tariffs on a variety of American products, which will take effect next month. Mr. Trump's tariff policy does not sit well with all its trading partners, leaving the world's biggest economy the odd one out.
Welcome to our discussion here. All of you, do you believe that the trade war is inevitable? Will it finally break out? And what would be the worst case scenario? I would love to have your answers on these two issues.
I think that it's become inevitable because the two parties now increase their tone, and Mr. Trump tried to really better the country attitude, try to dissuade China. On the other hand, China said they are going to use not only quantitative but also quantitative approach targeting U.S. So I'm rather pessimistic.
Maybe it's a matter of trading bluffs and accusations instead of having a real trade war. What are your thoughts, Mr. He?
Well, I can tell my inner resistance to say this is inevitable. Okay, I guess our human being always want something positive, right? But I think I share your pessimism to some extent, because right now I don't really see what are the leverages from the both sides. If you see this as like a poker game, right, you gotta have the bargaining chip. But now when the way is unfolding, I feel like for either side, it's looking like we're heading to somewhere. It's like a dead zone. So I don't know how either side can make the compromises. But again, we're in the world of unpredictability, right? Nobody can imagine what could happen between China and North Korea and the U.S. So it's still predictable, and I think it's totally possible that hey, some deal can be stricken at the last minute.
Do you agree that the trade war is becoming increasingly predictable?
Well, I mean, if you listen to what Mr. Trump says, he says it's already begun and we're already in the middle of it, or we've been in it since the WTO has started. I mean, since the WTO started, there's been 41 actions that have been brought. I think more have been brought by China against the U.S. than the U.S. against China, but they're close. I mean, it's roughly split. So what I think is that there's a lot of posturing. So I mean, I agree maybe with both parties by saying that certainly there's posturing that's being done, and that Mr. Trump has to appeal to a certain dynamic or demographic in the country to get past the 2018 elections. I think that he's making noises and he wants those numbers to change. I don't think it's necessarily, because remember, we said there was an absolute trade war coming in April, then it's in March, then it's in April, then it's in May. Now we're in June. We're still waiting for that trade war to begin. So I think, and then July 6th is the date it's supposed to start. And we know as lawyers, I mean, you give a demand letter to the other side, and then you're sort of waiting for something to happen. So I know it all seems like a bunch of panic for the average person who doesn't understand the mechanism of the ITC Section 301 actions, or understand the mechanisms of WTO. And first of all, those take like 3 years to get through once the dispute is started. I looked through the average.
On both sides across the Pacific Ocean, the United States and Beijing, we may have the best teams. But the question is whether we have the best lawyers to help defend both the American stakes and the Chinese ones. Do you have a clear idea as to the strength of the Chinese lawyers defending the Chinese national interest, or you'd rather show some kind of cynical sentiments?
I think those kind of dispute mainly involve the two issues. One is the U.S. domestic law side. Another one is the WTO law side. So you need some international lawyers that have an international mindset to deal with U.S. legal issues, but from international law angle. Then you need the WTO expert, but they know very well U.S. domestic law to argue before WTO panel. So I think you really need a big teamwork in order to help Chinese companies or Chinese government in dealing with U.S. administration.
I think it's probably less of the issue of the credibility of lawyers. Okay, it's probably more about the credibility of WTO actions. In fact, I think, in fact, the Chinese government's very experienced in handling the WTO disputes. They're a very, very solid team. It's actually probably more of the U.S. government that have a less willingness to U.S. WTO proceedings. I think that's true, right? U.S. government's really sort of have less trust of the whole WTO. If actually the WTO mechanism runs very well, you don't see this kind of bilateral threats. People just go to the WTO, have that resolved. For this case, there is a WTO case.
It might not be politically correct to say that the United States has displayed contempt for the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. However, it's likely that the United States will antagonize China, European Union, Canada, Mexico. It's a comprehensive world trade war. Are you confident that the Americans would be able to win?
Well, the irony is, and I don't know, I don't have a crystal ball, but the irony is that Bretton Woods, which was where this all started, in 1944, China, the Republic of China actually was involved. So before the end of the Second World War, and they came up with this idea about WTO. It was initially rejected, but the idea was that countries would be interdependent, okay, and that would stop wars, okay. That was one of the aspects of it. And so the irony is we're talking about a trade war when Bretton Woods was ironically set up by John Maynard Keynes and a number of other worldwide economists at the time to try to stop war. So and then they didn't contemplate, which is what we're talking about too, which is this idea of intellectual property or of national interest. So The problem is everybody can play in WTO, but if you say, hey, it's my national interest, whether it's U.S. or China or anybody else, that I have to kind of sidestep this one, or European Union for that matter, I'm going to sidestep this issue because, you know, Parma ham is an Italian issue. It's a national pride issue, and so then they sidestep that. So this thing becomes like a mile wide and a nano-inch deep, like an oil slick, and it's very difficult. And by the way, Chinese lawyers, fabulous. Work with them every single day. So they should have every kind of confidence in Chinese lawyers and law firms to be able to do it.
International law firm.
Yeah. No,
and
for sure.
most of the Chinese lawyers got educated in the United States.
But look at these
so
guys.
they know the American
brainiacs.
legal system.
The problem with the WTO is this, because now we have a big problem with, dispute settlement body, because U.S. for some reason, which they claim legitimate, kind of blocked the new nomination of this body. So therefore, in 1 year or 2 years' time, if you have no way to find out the solution, among the 7 members of the judge, you will have only one stay. So the whole system of this multilateral dispute settlement body will be dead. So that's a big threat for this international organization. So I think we should quickly find out the solution so that China can still use WTO as a venue to resolve the future dispute. Otherwise, we have an empty body. How you can deal with dispute resolution?
Do you share this note of pessimism about the prospects of having a strong WTO for the settlement of the disputes?
Yeah, I mean, everyone's always had a bit of, first it was most favored nations, and that was the run-up. Then it was WTO, and then WTO kind of got enforced intermittently, and it depended on the American administration, the Chinese administration. And
don't forget, the United States has adopted a unilateral approach. Mm-hmm. If the White House says UN Security Council is garbage, then it could be easily bypassed in launching a war on Iraq back in the year 2003. The same might be applied to the case of WTO. Yeah. If the United States finds that any moves in the WTO would not serve fundamentally the national interest of the United States, the WTO could be easily pushed aside.
Right. So that's why there's TPP. There was all this, the new kind of multilateral treaties.
Pull out from almost all multilateral agreements that President Obama reached with the rest
Human
of the
rights.
On the other hand,
UNESCO.
On the other hand, there's unilateral actions. The U.S. always try to, put some cosmetics to make it WTO compliant. So that's why they said, maybe we want to use safeguard measures so that in safeguard you have exemption, which is national security. That's why they said in Canada and other countries, it's a national security issue, therefore WTO have no right to look at the national security issue.
But don't you think the issue of national security has been too evasive, dodgy?
Well, every country is using that, right?
That's right. This is the first time with aluminum and steel. The United States has claimed that that's a national security issue. I mean, and I think it's the first time that they've done that. So that's what's sort of interesting under this administration, why it's changed. But that's the out card, which makes WTO teethless. Whether it's that or the European Union claiming something as a national interest, whether it's about food or whatever it is.
Thank you so much. You are watching Dialogue with Tao Jinzhou, managing partner of the Kurd LLP, He Jing, senior consultant at Angier Law Firm, and Edward Lehman, managing director of Lehman, Lee & Shi. We are discussing the upcoming trade war between the United States and perhaps the rest of the major economies the world over. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back, gentlemen. The issue is, what would be the worst-case scenario? Should such hostilities break out in the near future?
The worst-case scenario will be disaster. That means
no winners.
Yeah, no winners, because
but who will suffer most?
I think since China is a major exporter, from an export standpoint, China will suffer more because we have a 370 billion surplus. So therefore, China should suffer. On the other hand, you have a lot of investment in China by U.S. companies. And in that aspect, maybe U.S. will suffer more. You should remember that among all major industrial countries, there are only 2 countries that have no bilateral investment treaty, which is China and the U.S. So, therefore, U.S. may suffer because of the lack of such kind of treaty protection for American companies. So that's why.
Then one more follow-up question on the point of investment as well as the issue of national security. National security has always been cited by the U.S. government, even by governments like India, to protect their key strategically important infrastructure when it comes to Chinese investment. Now, latest development in the United States shows clearly that they're going to impose bans on Chinese investment in high technology areas. Will that lead to the decline of China's blueprint of 2025, made in China? I mean, that's a very important part in the current trade war between the 2 sides.
I think that will have actually a big impact on both sides. You know, I just came back from Silicon Valley. You know, we had a very interesting conference on the innovation in the biopharmaceutical sector. In fact, China and the U.S. side have lots of cross-border transaction, lots of R&D efforts in the biopharma sector. That's very, very promising area for both sides. Now, if the cross-border investments, the high-tech technology transfer are stopped because of executive order, that will create big uncertainty on both sides. You know, the U.S. companies, like for example, Silicon Valley investment firm will lose a big opportunity in China, and also the Chinese, the business partner will lose some great opportunity for doing the first-tier R&D. So that's definitely has very big negative impact on both sides. You know, for the Chinese side, I think our perspective is that, hey, we need to grow our technology. We need to be very strong in manufacturing. But the U.S. side see that, well, that's more like a challenge to their championship. But more so, I think the U.S. companies feel like, oh, if we are blocked from sharing these great opportunities, that's totally unfair for us, right? U.S. company or U.S. government always have two big concerns: market access versus protection of the private interests, like intellectual property. We have to deal with that. I think the 2025 strategy is on the top, but the underlying there's big concerns from both sides. We have to get that sorted out.
Well, what do you think are the most likely retaliations from the Chinese side? For example, do you foresee the pullout by Microsoft, Intel, Walmart, iPhone, Apple? Look at these big brands, including the United States. Are they going to all pull out of the Chinese market? And what does that mean for the electorate of Republicans? I mean, they are looking at midterm elections as well as whether President Trump will win yet another election 3 years from now.
Yeah, no, you're right. You have to unpack what is a company. You know, so Alibaba is the largest float on a New York bourse, on a U.S. bourse in the history of all bourses, of all exchanges. So is Alibaba an American company, or is it a Chinese company? Is Apple, has Foxconn make all of its products here and just a design company and intellectual property holder in the United States in Cupertino? Is that a U.S. company or a Chinese company? It begs the question, becomes very confusing. And so, and Starbucks certainly is actually retracting in the United States, expanding here in China. So, I mean, I'm kind of confused as to who wins and loses, meaning that these companies are multinational and the bottom line is to make money. I do not see them pulling out. I do see that there could be indirect non-tariff barriers that they would put in for corporations, for people here, that would be very difficult to understand unless you were living and working here.
Yes, national security as well as the environmental concerns would always be cited as the non-visible or invisible barriers, non-tariff barriers.
But to a certain extent, I think that America's already lost the war, and I'll tell you why. Because I think that if you look at graduate programs, if you look at postgraduate programs, in all of the STEM, the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, it's inundated with Chinese people. I mean, and so the question is, are they Chinese? Are they going to return back here? Are they going to stay in the United States? I mean, what's the deal there? So, and I think that with everything, every kind of barrier you put up, there's going to be 6 ways to get around that so-called barrier as well, by the innovative Chinese or Americans in doing what needs to be done to get things done for business.
Ironically, Mr. He, do you see this trade war as an opportunity for further reform of the SOE so that non-public sector of the Chinese economy will enjoy more leeway and margin for their maneuvers. For example, they're going to get more preferential policies and the loans from the state-owned commercial banks. So far, we don't see such a level playing field that benefits the non-public sector. And therefore, there are some voices coming from China. Look, a trade war is bad, something bad, but probably it's an opportunity to reform the SOE. But I mean, this could be a politically sensitive issue for the Chinese authorities. From the perspective of a lawyer,
I think we all hope so, right? In fact, if you're looking at the major policy initiatives announced by the top governments, there's lots of reform are supposed to come. Actually, some of it in place, but it probably have not been implemented the way we all wish to be. And one of the areas we're actually looking at, the measure we're always looking at, the intellectual property. Okay, if you look at the 2025 strategy, they talk about the IP, but they definitely not be given enough place or position or priority for the IP protection. If a foreign company or American companies can be given good access, a fair access, yes, state-owned companies are one of the issues. And also, hey, whether the American companies' technology or IP can be sufficiently protected, and that's one of the very big fundamental concerns. But however, when you look at the strategy, it's mentioned, but it really have not been emphasized. So I think the kind of a challenge by the U.S. government could be actually absorbed or transformed into some very more positive policies in China. It's already happening. Okay, we just saw the State Council made this big announcements, which include the protection of trade secrets, protection against the benefits trademarks. There's a ton of things that are happening in the pipelines. I think that probably the same thing is going to happen with the SOE ownership.
Edward, what do you think of the 301 article?
Well, the 301 is the International Trade Commission, and so that's the mechanism on which that they will stop. It's called in rem jurisdiction. So it'll be all those things that are identified. There'll be doesn't matter what company they come from, but if they're those things, those items, it's actually product, listed. All computers, all whatever they aerospace. That will be stopped at the border at customs. It's supposed to start on July the 6th, but that doesn't really mean it's going to start July the 6th. It is an administrative action that will be begun, but there will be negotiations back and forth. And China will bring its lawyers, and they will be able to sit down and say why this is unfair, and they'll get a fair hearing with regards to that. I also want to say that America with regard to the government, it's a little bit disingenuous. I mean, they've got 21 persons here at diplomatic missions from the United States Patent and Trademark Office. Not one of them is admitted into the USPTO. Not one of them has a STEM background. They themselves don't even, they're their own problem, okay? The problem was started administrations ago. This is a very difficult thing to say, but it's unfortunate. You got a bunch of people who can't shoot straight, essentially, on the intellectual property, which is setting policies and identifying where intellectual property problems exist, and they didn't do a good job. And so now we're trying to make up for all these kind of problems. And, so a lot of this has been induced, as Mr. Trump has said, by our own side.
Jingo?
Yeah. On the other hand, interestingly, you see that for all these months, we never really, Chinese companies or Chinese government, never tried to initiate the legal remedy with U.S. court. Even ZTE, they didn't go to the court to say maybe you have to review the decision of Trump administration. Maybe it's against the law. So I think
why the silence? Why the yeary silence of the Chinese companies?
Because maybe the Chinese way of doing the thing, because they thought Trump have all powers. If we can deal well with Trump,
but
everything will be resolved.
Nicely. I mean, that really worked out very nicely. I mean, that was showstopper for ZTE. That was it. End of game. They stopped trading, went down to zero. And Mr. Trump said almost as soon as it was the laws came out about it, or the judgment came out about ZTE, then he said, I think we'll work this thing out. Got him $1 billion fine. I mean, it's big
money. But the lawmakers in the D.C. said no. They want to sentence the ZTE to the death penalty.
Right. But no. But like I said,
we see discrepancies. We saw serious disputes on the American team, the delegation, and between the White House and the lawmaking body.
Yeah, I think we should look at this judicial remedy, whether there are any availability for Chinese companies targeted by this 301, and also for other, trade actions initiated by Trump. All those needed to be reviewed by the judicial body. So because they have a separation of power, we have to use this part of the power to deal with our...
Now, gentlemen, before we conclude this very interesting and intellectually stimulating discussion, a very short question, and quickly I'd like to have your comments. This year, we're going to witness the 40th anniversary of China's reform and opening up. Now, with this upcoming trade war around the corner, do you think there are some benefits from the trade war so that we can review our policy options, whether we should further open up the Chinese market and reform of the SOE? I mean, what are the benefits from, because in Chinese we say 危机, there are opportunities in the crisis, right? So you do not always look at the bad things from negative perspectives, right? Do you?
No, I think we can well use this trade war as an accelerator for Chinese reform, because we have two ways to deal with this. Either we close our door so that shut down all the U.S., or we make China even more opener to be welcome for foreign investment. I think this is a right attitude that the Chinese government should adopt.
It looks like a strategic option ahead of the Chinese authorities. So what are your thoughts?
I would use this word empathy. For years, China always asked the American side to say, hey, you got to really understand our system. We're poor, we're a developing country, so we got to do whatever we need to do. But it's also time for us to give some empathy to the American side to really fully understand what the foreign companies are asking for in terms of legal environment and regulatory environment. We're coming from that and decide what kind of reform we really need to put in place. So.
Yeah, I think all these kind of things are great signals to the public, to the general public, that Xi Jinping and that the foreign policy of China is about becoming a world leader. I mean, in the last 2 days or over the weekend, they had Xi Jinping was talking to in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs about its place in the world affairs and about how to live together with everyone in harmony. So I mean, it's a completely opposite viewpoint from Mr. Trump, which is interesting. But I think that this is a good point for both countries to be able to rally and become better because of it. And I think at the end, a lot of this is negotiation by Mr. Trump, who likes to do this stuff. That's what he's well known for.
Thank you so much. Well, all players involved in the game are giving a second thought to what's going on, the trade war, including perhaps the media, whether we have talked too smart about the strength of China. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.